These days, green watches are all the rage. But today, we have the watches that started it all, and that is, of course, the Rolex Submariner. And it's not every day that you have the full family of green Submariners right next to each other. So today we're going to go over a quick intro on each different model within the family, where it all started, and a little bit of an idea of where it's going to go in the future. But let's start out with the watch that really started the whole green watch craze in general, and that was just with a change of a bezel. And that is the Rolex Submariner 16610 LV, also known as the Kermit. On the face of it, this is just a green bezel Submariner, nothing too special. However, in 2003 when this was released, this was really a game changer in many ways for the Rolex sports watch lineup. It was the first time that the bezel of a Rolex steel sports watch, other than the GMT, featured any color. And the color itself was very important. The fact that it was green, which is representative of Rolex's branding colors, gives you a bit of an idea of the intent with this watch. Because this wasn't just a regular production introduction, instead, this was the 50th anniversary model. But there were also other subtle changes that indicated a little bit of a change in the tides and also indicated what was coming soon for the Submariner. The first is that it didn't have the drilled lug holes, which up until roughly that point were still relatively common to find on the 16610. You also had the introduction of the maxi dial on a Submariner. Now, while the maxi dial was introduced originally on the Yachtmaster years before, it hadn't made its way yet to the Submariner. So the interesting thing here is that you actually had two variants of the same reference number, the 16610, with different dial styles. And that's something that showed what would eventually evolve into the 11610, which did have the maxi dial on regular production. When we look at the Kermit, the main thing you realize is of course the shade of green. However, over its 7-year production run, there were various different shades of green depending on when it was made. There were some that were more sort of an olive color, some were a little bit brighter, some were a little bit darker as the model progressed through the years. Another big change is also to do with the fore. The initial models had what's known as a flat fore, which had a much sort of wider and flatter profile on the top compared to what you see on this model, for example, which has what's known as the pointed fore. You can see it still does have a little flat bit at the top, however, it isn't as wide as what's normally found on the flat fore. Aside from that though, it's still a regular Submariner, 300 meters of water resistance, the caliber 3135 on the inside, but as I mentioned before, this was just the beginning. Because 7 years later, after the introduction of the Kermit, we moved on to the Hulk. Now this was a first in a lot of major ways. For one thing, it was the first regular production steel Submariner that had color on the bezel. So while yes, the Kermit wasn't a limited edition per se, it was an anniversary edition. However, this was released at the same time as the black bezel version. Another evolution is the fact that it was the first colored dial on a stainless steel Submariner. While we had seen blue dials, for example, on the two-tone and gold versions, we never saw anything other than a black dial on the stainless steel models. The Hulk changed all that, and it changed it in a major way, because this wasn't just a regular green gloss dial, instead it was a green sunburst. So as you tilt it through the light, you can actually see the different shades of green and the ways that the light plays with it. On the bezel, we have, of course, Rolex's Cerachrome, this time rendered in green, and again, over time, you will see this change going from the Hulk moving on to its successor, the Cermit, but we'll talk about that in a moment. The reason why the Hulk got its name was obviously partly because of its green color, but also because the introduction of the 6-digit reference introduced the maxi case to the Submariner. So that gave it much bigger shoulders around the lugs, and that gave it that sort of bigger, beefed up profile, hence the reason the Hulk, versus the relatively skinny Kermit. On the inside though, it actually still shares the same movement as the Kermit, the 3135, because Rolex had kept this in production from 1988 right up until, in the Submariner's case at least, the eventual replacement with the 3235 that we find in the Starbucks. The Hulk is an interesting proposition though, because when they replaced it, they got rid of that green dial, which means it's a relatively isolated case within the model line. So this green dial is something that's very, very highly sought after, because who knows when it might come back. That being said though, the Hulk did have a 10-year production run from 2010 to 2020, so there are still quite a few units out there, and collectors are very quick to snap them up when they do find them. But of course, now we have to move on to the current. And the current from 2020 is the reference 126610 LV. Now this, introduced in 2020, much like the Hulk, is part of the regular production. It wasn't part of an anniversary, it's not a special edition, it's not limited. However, it does differ from the Hulk in that it brings back the black dial. So the color scheme is much more reminiscent of that original anniversary model that we had with the Kermit. Now in terms of naming, the internet is divided. Some call it the Starbucks because it's so similar to the Starbucks logo. Others call it the Cermit because it is essentially a ceramic version of the Kermit. But apart from that, it is a regular normal 126610 in the sense that it has the caliber 3235, the updated one on the inside, 300 meters water resistance, it has the glide lock, and it does have the slimmed down lugs, so it does, even in that sense, hark back to the original Kermit. Now of course, this being Rolex, it's not clear how long this is going to be in production, whether they'll cut it, whether they'll keep it for the entire duration like they did with the Hulk. We don't know, and it's hard to tell, especially relatively early on, how many of these have already been made. That being said though, collectors still covet all three of these much more than their black counterparts because they are in general much less common compared to the standard black Submariner dates. So that's just a quick overview of these three green Submariners. And the interesting thing though is that this middle one, the Hulk, is the one that really took things up a notch. And that's because it was in production during the time when Rolex hype really started to increase, and it was something special compared to the plethora of black dial, black bezel Rolexes that most people were used to. Now though, this is discontinued, and this is still in current production. So the question is, which one do you prefer? Do you prefer the original, the Kermit, the one that was actually an anniversary model and that features a bit of a mix of different features when you compare it to a regular 16610? Do you prefer the Hulk, the one that brought in the green dial, the one that makes a much bigger impact when you talk about color compared to either of the other two? However, it was also around for the longest, 10 years versus 7 years versus currently 3 years. And also it was still a bit of a mix in terms of the features. It has the same old movement, however it has the newer Cermit bezel and the newer bracelet and clasp. Or do you want the newest one? The one that harks back to the original but brings all of Rolex's newest technologies together at the same time, while still having a slightly slimmer profile on the lugs, modern bracelet, and modern movement. Love to know your thoughts in the comments below. And of course, if you're interested in any of these, make sure you visit the links in the description below to see our full range of Submariners, including, for now at least, this full family of green Submariners. Of course, if you liked the video, make sure you like it and share it. If you want to see more videos about watches, then make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell as well so you know when the next video comes out. In any case, thanks for joining us on this quick journey throughout the history of the green Submariner, and we look forward to seeing you on the next one.